Hi, I'm Brendan Moriarty, and he's on assignment in the Middle East. And this is Fire and Line Reloaded. He's charged me with the task of assembling some local students to discuss relevant issues. Today we'll be discussing election reforms. And this is Charlie, president of Turning Point USA, Callie, a junior at Prospect High School, and Rob, a sophomore at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So after the presidential election, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights issued a report from the election observers about the election and how it went. Although they said that it was overall professional and some changes were needed though. And some of these changes that they argued for were things such as redistricting, voting rights, registration, and voter IDs. So, Charlie, what do you believe are some of the reforms that the U.S. should be implementing going forward in elections?
I think that this election taught us a lot about the system we've implemented. The first of which is the problems of gerrymandering. We saw that in our own state. And I think gerrymandering is starting to put moderates to be extinct. We're having extremes on both sides. Look at the state of Illinois. The most moderate member of Congress, Bob Dole, was voted out in a D+11. It was unfortunate to see a lot of moderates across the country lose because of gerrymandered districts. Also, I think that we really, really need voter ID reform. I'll say it by one reason only. In Philadelphia, 52 precincts did not have one vote for Governor Romney. Went 100% to Obama. 25,000 votes, not one vote. Now, if that defies logic. 25,000 to none in all Philadelphia in one area. We need voter ID reform, and looking at reports across the country, we need to rethink the way we do a lot of elections.
So, Callie, voter ID and gerrymandering. What do you think that we should be doing to address these issues?
Well, I think voter ID should be something that's looked into because the United States is kind of irregular in the sense that we are one of very few nations that doesn't require any sort of ID, and I think especially considering in this election there were many issues with non-government organizations trying to ensure that voter fraud didn't occur, and that raised a whole nother issue that I think it's really important that our government takes a strong stance on regulating this issue.
All right. Rob, gerrymandering?
I think how our national elections are administered is a disgrace. We're the only industrialized, developed Western democracy which doesn't know its results in a timely fashion. I think one of the things we need to do first off is have an independent, federally administered set of guidelines for elections. All right, it's completely nonsensical that every few years control over gerrymandering, control over how you're going to vote in your state, control over what are the expectations for voter identification are taken on by political people at the state level, by people in state houses, by people in governor's mansions, because they have a clear ideological bend to do things in their favor. If you look at other countries, they have independent bureaus which create these set of guidelines which everyone agrees to, everyone says is fair, and which are administered nationally. There's no hubbub about how things are in Ohio, how things are in Wisconsin. One of the things we could do, and this kind of hits at the voter ID thing, is biometric scanning. Brazil, several other countries that are much poorer than us have well-maintained biometric scanning devices which prevent people from impersonating. If your real question is voter impersonation, then let's have people register to vote, give a sample, actually say this is you, this is your print, you go in there, you do that, and that could be a form of identification. Or if we're too cheap to do that, let's get some of that ridiculous awesome ink the Iraqis had during their election so you can't run around, with voting several times, because it was pretty effective. It was like, oh, that dude voted today. He has a bunch of ink on his hand.
Isn't that what the stickers are for?
Well, Charlie, although you wouldn't necessarily be having an ID, do you think that something to the effect that what Rob proposed would be good?
Yeah, I think a verification process is needed. And going back to gerrymandering, look at the state of Iowa. They do it symmetrically, they do it fair, And I think because of that, they have congressmen from both sides of the aisle that represent, that used to be a very red state and now it's turning blue, but they get different viewpoints from across the state because it's truly done, envision Iowa, it's done right down the middle like a windowsill, essentially. And look at Illinois, it's a mess. It's like if you threw paint on a canvas.
So I you should propose or ask this to the panel. Do we believe that individual states should be trying to get these independent panels, or how they draw them is much like what you said in Iowa, or do you think that this should something be administered at the federal level? Rob, I already know that you think it should be done at the federal level, but what do you two believe?
I'm not sure how I feel state versus federal. I feel that states probably have a better idea of what's going on, what their specific needs need to be tailored to. However, I think the issue with gerrymandering is by paying so much attention to it, we end up doing more harm than help, because by doing it too much, we're affecting certain groups. By doing it too less, we're not helping other groups, and I think in some ways it's best to just stick to a uniform system.
Usually I'm very big on states' rights, but you look at what's happened in a lot of states across the country that have unequal representation. I think that there's a need for reform on the national level, and you do need to continue to have states have little intricacies. For example, in some ways Alaska has different voting hours than Florida. Of course you need that. You need to have states have different intricacies. There's more rural areas where they need to provide transportation. You need to have states be able to tailor things to their needs. But as far as, I heard some interesting ideas that I'm not totally sure I feel, like a national voting day would be something interesting. New Jersey had voting online. There's other things. Yeah, when the Hurricane Sandy, you were able to vote through email or some verification process. I think we need to rethink the way that we do elections in this country. And it's not a political issue, but it's an issue that we need to preserve our republic in the future.
All right. To transition a little bit, a fairly political one, but I believe that has been affecting both parties, especially if you look at how the Republican nominee was selected, and then obviously the influence of the national election. Campaign finance reform. So, Rob, what do you think we should be doing with campaign finance reform?
I think we need to impose strict limits on campaign finance because money is not the equivalent of speech. You can't go to a town hall meeting and sit in the back with a megaphone. We don't allow that. So to say that a multi-billionaire like Sheldon Adelson can give hundreds of millions of dollars of campaign and put that speech in the same level as an average American who can barely scrape by $20, $50 to put into a campaign is not fair, because we're essentially endorsing the megaphone idea. And we've already seen what happens when we allow unlimited amounts of money to come into these campaigns. We have shady outside groups coming in, making dubious claims. We have people jacking up the cost to run an election, which means it's more difficult for concerned citizens to make their voices heard and actually be on the issues. I think campaign finance reform is essential if we want to go forward, fight the radicalism, and fight all of this other political misgivings.
Now, one of the complaints that several Republicans, I believe, and Fox contributors made was that a lot of for the nomination process, that Newt Gingrich really hammered Mitt Romney, and that this ended up hurting him, and a lot of money that he got was from Sheldon Adelson. So, Charlie, what do you believe?
I think it's a problem that the GOP needs to address, and I think that the GOP could learn a lot from the Democrats. When the Democrats have a good nominee, they get behind it, and that's being said. The exception being Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. They really went after each other, but they actually came together rather nicely, and Hillary campaigned for Barack Obama down the road. But as far as the campaign finance and Sheldon Adelson being able to bankroll one person for months on end, at first I thought it was a big issue, but you look at the end result, it looks like both super PACs on both sides pretty much crossed each other out. For the most part, you had Crossroads at Karl Rove, and you had Priorities Action on the other side. The spending was almost equal on both sides of the aisle, and actually Barack Obama's campaign outspent Governor Romney's campaign. And for the first time in history, we had people on congressional seats not being outspent and still winning. So it was an interesting dynamic, and as far as campaign finance reform, I think that we need to, I don't think any new regulation or laws are needed. It just ends up canceling each other on both sides of the aisle.
How about you?
Well, while even if they cancel each other out, I think too much funding is spent, and I agree with Rob that it should be further regulated just by virtue of the fact that what this money is not going to better informing the American people, and it's more hot air, frankly, than it is of actual substance. And I think it's important that especially in a time like this when the American public isn't as informed about their politics as they used to be, that we're more focused on giving them accurate information instead of bragging about whose party wins.
Well, I mean, this obviously brings up the issue of media, which is actually a perfect transition to what I was going to bring up next. And obviously, we can still talk a little bit about campaign finance reform, but the conduct of the campaign towards the media. Now, there are a lot of complaints, from both sides about both candidates that they were not only shutting out, journalists, but just the way that they treated them. So, this is both an issue of how the campaign should be regulating themselves and possibly looking at some form of legislation. Mm-hmm. So, what do we believe the conduct of the campaigns towards the media should be? Charlie?
In regards to conduct, I'll be the first one to say it. I think that the media is obviously very left, except a couple news outlets, of course. And I think that the journalists have not been doing their job the past year and a half. And I would love to disagree with somebody I'd love to talk to somebody who disagrees that thinks that Benghazi was accurately covered. I believe that all the facts were not given to the American people, and I think that there were a lot of things that were withheld from journalists that were on in Libya and throughout until after the election. And
well, I think that to perhaps direct the question a little bit more is how should the campaigns be treating journalists in not only just specific issues of how the media is covering certain current events, but how the campaign is specifically working with the media.
The campaign should be working with the media in a transparent and fair manner. They shouldn't be treating them any differently just because they're the gatekeepers of information. They should be treating them and all Americans equally. I'd have to disagree with Charlie. I think what we have is a media that's profit-driven. We're into racehorse journalism, and you can just look time and time again on the media actually showing this bias. It was pretty obvious for a very long time with people who actually sat down with a statistics textbook and poll numbers that Barack Obama was going to win this election. And in fact, so obvious that a lot of people were picking it 100% correct. What you did see, however, in the point of the media was covering the races if it was A, much closer than it really was, because that kept up ratings, and B, picking up on any type of surge momentum by Romney to say that he was getting closer. And this is time and time again. This was in 12 for Romney. You can look back at the 2000 campaign when Gore looked like he had a solid lead in October. They started going after his gaffe. They started going after, I created the internet. The news media isn't some big right or left conspiracy. It's a profit-driven enterprise that's trying to make money. So that's why they're into racehorse journalism, into sensationalism, into not representing the facts. So that's ultimately what your biggest problem with media is.
So, profit-driven news reporting. Kelly, what do you believe are some of the ways that we can address this, especially as it relates to campaigns?
Well, I definitely think there is an issue because, as Rob mentioned, there is more incentive for profit than actually giving real information. And I don't have exact ideas what should be done to enforce said policies, but I think there's definitely an issue because now major news businesses are choosing fanaticism over actual substance, which is what we need.
I think you made it. Although you perhaps did not mean to. News businesses.
And there's
I want to interject. I don't think there's anything wrong with profit. First of all, if they're getting viewers, there's nothing wrong with that. Second of all, the right journalism, Fox does lean right, is outnumbered 10-1. CBS does have journalists. They did a study. They did a Pew Research study that said, journalists, where do you fall politically? And 72% of them said we do fall on the liberal side. And they said, how does that ever affect your journalism? And a majority says at times it does. And there's nothing wrong with having liberal journalists. It's just there are instance after instance after instance where they show that reporting is slanted to the other side. And there are headlines done. And you look at what's happened with Israel. CNN showed a picture of a child that was blown to pieces, and they said, Israel strikes Gaza again, but it was a picture taken in Tel Aviv. And it wasn't Gaza. It was it was not accurate. It happens time and time again.
I just want to go back to a little bit of what the actual topic is. I mean, obviously this is good discussion. I don't want to stifle good discussion, but the topic is election reforms, and I think that can we come to a little consensus that the campaign should be more transparent with how they relate to the media?
Definitely.
They should.
All right. Good to get some consensus. Now I'm going to move on to perhaps a little something closer to what we were talking about earlier, but the idea of not just voting. Well, we'll try and get to this discussion later, but we're going to be taking a break. Welcome back, and we'll now be moving to, I believe, another topic of interest, fiscal cliff. Now, the fiscal cliff is obviously an amalgamation of various taxes being implemented and spending cuts that are becoming in 2013. Now, the fiscal cliff was obviously a result of what happened in 2010, but I believe that this is something we could definitely talk about. So first, we'll be talking about the Bush tax cuts. Now, what do we believe should be done regarding the Bush tax cuts? Should they be fully extended, partially extended? Kelly?
To be perfectly honest, I feel like partial extension would be a good answer just because, I mean, government is here to protect consumers. It's here to protect businesses. And to have such a radical change in such a short period of time would be a shock to consumers and a shock to businesses. So I think it would be best for a partial extension.
I mean, would you like to elaborate on how it would be extended?
Well, I mean, personally, I feel like some of the upper class probably have lesser extensions. I feel like more focus needs to be given to middle and lower classes just because they're feeling the effects of the recession the hardest, but I could be wrong.
Charlie?
I think that this illustrates that we need serious tax reform, and I think almost everybody here can agree. We need to stop these midnight deals, and we need to have long-term pro-growth tax reform. And as far as the extension, I think that unfortunately, in a pragmatic sense, it's not going to happen. We're not going to get the IRS to see them to change all the rates. I would say extend every single Bush tax cut, but only if we do get serious cuts, and that does mean defense should be on the table. Everything should be reformed. We should have entitlement reform, we should have Social Security reform, and Medicare and Medicaid reform in extension. That would be something I think that they could agree on. And I think that the Bush tax cuts would be detrimental to not only middle-class Americans, but a lot of small businesses all across the country.
So, Rob, obviously I think we can all agree that there needs to be tax reforms, but do you think that this should something wait till after the fiscal cliff or try and address it beforehand?
I think in the short term, you should address the fiscal cliff first. And we shouldn't let panic over the fiscal cliff force us to take a bad medium and long-term solution. Because America isn't faced with an immediate problem with our deficits and debt as it is vis-a-vis inflation and our ability to borrow. We're faced by a medium and long-term problem with the growth of entitlements and with shortfalls in revenue. So whatever we do with the fiscal cliff, I think I agree, we need substantive reform, but we shouldn't rush it before the cliff. If we can get it beforehand, I'm willing to take it. However, I don't want a sense of urgency to be misplaced and lead to bad medium and long-term policy.
So I think an interesting, obviously Kelly said that we should be gearing more of the cuts towards middle income and low income earners, and there's probably a little bit of a difference in the opinion as to how about extending it for high income earners.
Would you raise them, Rob, for the higher income earners?
Yes, I would. I think this election was was pretty much a referendum on that entire fact.
But you're a Keynesian, right? For the most part.
I'm not raising them because they're stimulatory in nature.
Well,
I'm raising them because I see that our country has.
I think we need to make a distinction between extending the Bush tax cuts for the wealthiest and not extending them. And I believe what he's saying is that they should not be extended. I mean,
right.
Do you agree?
I'm saying it should. Here's the thing: is we're going to have to make decisions. I'm saying that ultimately, it is worse to cut essential programs than to expect the rich to pay a little bit more, because effectively they're both anti-growth.
I understand.
Having one people get fewer goods and services for which to go out with, or having fewer transfers, and having someone else pay more in is effectively the same thing. What I'm saying is that given the option, I would let those tax cuts expire as opposed to cutting services for other people.
That is more articulate than most on the left make the argument, because by Maynard Keynes' own words, tax increases during a recession are deflationary. Yeah. Right, so a tax increase on small businesses would be deflationary. And the upper income earners, a lot of small businesses file as individuals. And they create millions of jobs. Yeah, Brent?
So I think you bring up an interesting topic that obviously we could discuss, is the idea of how a Bush extension tax cut or failure to extend them would be affecting small businesses. Now, a study by the CBO said that 96% of businesses, small businesses that file as individuals, are below the 250 or the 400,000, the lowest bracket. So an extension, a failure to extend the highest tax cut would not affect 96% of businesses.
But what that study doesn't tell you is that 4% the 4% create 65% of our jobs. So that's what the study doesn't tell you. I'm just interjecting that.
Okay. I just wanted to mention that before we go on to the next topic, which is obviously the sequestration. So to briefly fill in viewer, sequestration is what if at a certain point the spending for discretionary, programs were to exceed a certain point, that they would be unable to spend any money, regardless of the political situation or on how it's being spent. So, what do we believe should be done regarding the sequestration of various programs? Rob?
Again, I just feel like we should allow the sequestration to take place if we don't have a viable medium and long-term solution. So we committed ourselves to making these cuts. If we can't make the proper cuts and any compromise is going to be negative in the medium and long term, we should just allow it to happen.
Okay. Across the board cuts? Charlie?
I'm not going to totally disagree, but I'm going to try to find a flaw. Wouldn't that create a misplacement in aggregate demand if we stop spending that money?
Yeah, it would. It's terrible short-term fiscal policy, and if you look at the drags that are going to be put in place, but for some reason we're predisposed with having this discussion over deficits and debts, and it feels like if we don't have something happen.
Well, I tend to agree with you that we do need to make spending cuts. I'm just trying to further articulate or find out, because I know that you've advocated for more stimulus.
Yeah, I think it's bad. I think it's bad short-term policy.
But long-term, could you see that?
And I think it's also bad long-term policy. But my fear right now is that, considering how poor the Democrats and Republicans have shown themselves at handling the economy, that they could bargain themselves into an even worse deal.
All right, Kelly. Well, I just want to. Obviously, we've heard a good deal from both Charlie and Rob. But what do you believe of this sequestration? Obviously, it's probably not a good idea to necessarily just cut regardless of how it's being spent or the need for which it's being spent. But do you think it's necessary?
Well, I think some spending cuts at this point are inevitable just by virtue of the fact of how our economy is functioning. However, I think we need to take very deep consideration into what we are cutting, because there are lots of people right now, unemployment is very high, that need these certain programs, and if we don't even look at what kind of people need these programs and how they're being used as of late, then we're doing a disservice.
Now, bring up an interesting topic, which obviously is the next one, which would be the expiration of the federal unemployment benefits. So this is another thing that will be faced during the fiscal cliff, and do we believe that it should be extended? Charlie?
The specifics are really fuzzy. It would take us about 20 minutes to go through all the specifics. There's a lot of insurance things and other things that go into it, but I think we need to totally restructure it. And I'll go back. I believe it's immoral to continue to continue to borrow trillions of dollars a year, and everything needs to be on the table. And that means defense, it means unemployment benefits, it means food stamps, it means Medicare, Medicaid, reforms and cuts. And it will hurt. It might hurt in the short term. It might end up being a blessing in the long term. And that's what we need to look at, because our debt is a serious national security and cultural threat to our future.
Callie, I just wanted, what do you believe that we should be doing regarding the federal unemployment benefits?
Well, I think we need to take a serious look at them and how they're actually helping or not helping people on unemployment, because as of right now, they're basically acting as a Band-Aid on the problem. What we need to be looking at is how to decrease unemployment.
Rob?
Yeah, I agree with that. I also agree that if we're going to be paying these people money, we should be using them for works programs. We should be actually investigating the similar things we used during the Great Depression. It doesn't make sense to have people on unemployment for 200 weeks and not get anything out of it. We should make a work requirement for unemployment, like a works program with the WPA during the recession, or the Tennessee Valley Authority. We should be taking this time to make those necessary improvements to our infrastructure, which we haven't done for the last couple decades.
I would agree, and I usually don't agree with Rob on as far as fiscal policy, but as far as allocation of resources, it makes more sense to use that money towards something of production rather than having them sit at home and maybe stimulate demand by ordering a pizza. Instead, it'd be better for them to build something, and it would be a better allocation of resources. And that would be my point that I want to make is efficiency. We can make everything more efficient without necessarily draconian cuts, I think is the vernacular being used.
And I think the other thing that such a works program would do is it really helps the most vulnerable workers in this type of economy, which are low-skill workers or people in low medium-skilled jobs. And it would prevent the type of couch grazing you see from some people who are middle or upper income skill levels, or are medium upper skill type jobs who see unemployment as a 2 or 3 month vacation.
And it would be better, what I'm trying to say is we don't add new works programs, but we have people currently on unemployment have to transition to that, not necessarily saying we need a new stimulus of works programs, just to re-articulate what I was saying.
So obviously we're talking not just in the fiscal cliff about the effect on the deficit, but also about unemployment. Now, according to CBO estimates, if nothing were to be done to avoid the fiscal cliff, we would see a cut of $487 billion to the deficit for 2013. But this would come at the cost of a 0.5% reduction in growth. So it would actually be, whereas if we were to stop everything that would be happening in the fiscal cliff, we would only see a cut in $91 billion in the deficit for 2013 and an increase in 1.7% in growth. So what do we believe, or the growth would be 1.7% in 2013.
Is that GDP growth?
Yes,
okay.
Growth in GDP. So how do we believe, obviously we're talking, there needs to be a mix of both cutting the deficit in the future and trying to save some of the programs that are being seen on the chopping block of the fiscal cliff. So I just want to direct this to Callie first, and then Rob and Charlie. What do you believe are the most important things that we should be, if nothing else were to be done on the fiscal cliff, what do you think is the most important program that should be targeted?
Most important program, that's tricky.
Or tax cut.
Yeah, I think we really need to focus on the people that are hurting the most right now, which is obviously the unemployed. And I think that it's very important that we hold, I don't know exactly, I don't want to put a price on certain programs because they mean very different things to very different groups of people that are equally important. However, I agree that we should do our best to make sure that this is as stable a transition as possible for the individuals and who are currently hurting.
Charlie?
First of all, I would like to challenge the notion that using GDP as an accurate measure for growth, because it factors in government spending. So when you say we're going to have negative growth, it's because of the amount of government that we are spending. It doesn't necessarily mean private sector production. $457 billion is, a lot, but it's necessary at times. I don't think that all that should happen. I think that we need to go through every program and make about 10% cut in almost every single federal program that includes defense. I think that tax cuts need to be reevaluated. Unfortunately, the pragmatist, I see that the tax cuts will probably be like a three-month extension is what I think is going to happen, and the spending cuts, they're probably going to end up trimming around the edges, and entitlement reform will get kicked down the road farther. But ideally, we need to look at Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security and stop these unbelievable growth in interest that we'll see in the next 10 years from borrowing, and that is rooted in entitlement reform, because those are the biggest drivers of our debt.
Rob, you get the last word. What if you were to only make one change at the fiscal cliff? What would you change?
Put better leadership in Washington. That's what I would change. I mean, I don't have the confidence that either party is going to give us a good medium and long-term solution. As a pure Keynesian, I would want them not to go over the cliff at all. But just as a pragmatist, they should just go through with the sequestration, because if we wait along and let them discuss even more, they'll come up with an even worse idea.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've had a productive discussion, and obviously this will continue again. I'm Brendan Moriarty. This is Fire and Line Reloaded.